February 17th, 1917. North Atlantic, 90 miles southwest of Ireland. Commander Gordon Campbell stood on the bridge of what appeared to be a battered Norwegian collier, the Loderer, watching a white torpedo wake slice through the grey water toward his ship. In that frozen moment, he faced a decision that would have paralyzed most men. Let 400 pounds of high explosive slam into his vessel and pray his crew survived, or take evasive action and watch months of planning evaporate as the German submarine slipped back into the depths. He chose the torpedo. Campbell gripped the rail and did something that violated every instinct of seamanship. He adjusted course slightly, not away from the deadly track, but to ensure it would strike exactly where he wanted. Behind him, his officers watched in silent horror as their commander steered HMS Farnborough, disguised as the innocent Loderer, into the path of certain destruction. The torpedo struck aft by the engine room bulkhead at 9:52 a.m. with a thunderous explosion that lifted the stern out of the water. Steel plates buckled. Water cascaded into the hold. Men were thrown from their feet, and Commander Campbell smiled. This was the most audacious form of naval warfare ever conceived. HMS Farnborough wasn't a merchant ship at all. She was a heavily armed warship masquerading as helpless prey, what the Royal Navy called a Q-ship. Hidden behind fake cargo and collapsing bulkheads were 5 12-pounder guns and a crew of hardened volunteers who had just gambled their lives that their ship could survive a torpedo hit. Now came the hardest part. Convincing U-83's commander, Captain Lieutenant Bruno Hoppe, that he'd won. The stakes couldn't have been higher. In the first 2 months of 1917, German U-boats had sent nearly 1 million tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the Atlantic. At this rate, Britain would run out of food, fuel, and ammunition within 6 months. The island nation that had ruled the waves for 2 centuries was being strangled by an enemy it couldn't see, couldn't catch, and couldn't kill. Germany's submarines were winning the war, and Britain was running out of time. Q-ships represented Britain's most desperate gamble. Turn merchant vessels into floating traps, use human beings as bait, and lure U-boats close enough to blow them out of the water. It was psychological warfare at its most intimate and lethal. By the time the war ended, these mystery ships would be credited with destroying somewhere between 12 and 15 U-boats, a modest tally that nonetheless required courage bordering on madness. And on this grey February morning, with his ship flooding and U-83 circling like a shark, Commander Campbell was about to execute the performance of his life. By the end of this story, you'll understand why this matters more than the numbers suggest. You'll see how a handful of volunteers in disguised ships waged psychological warfare against an enemy that held all the advantages. You'll witness acts of courage that somehow got forgotten by everyone except military historians who still study these actions in hushed tones. And you'll discover why the Q-ship program, despite its limited tactical success, may have saved Britain from defeat in ways that statistics can never capture. But we can't just jump straight to that moment on Farnborough's sinking deck. Without understanding the context, you can't grasp the sheer desperation that drove Britain to create these death traps, or the psychological toll of asking men to stand motionless while shells and torpedoes tore their ships apart. The story begins not in 1917, but in the opening months of World War I, when a new weapon emerged that would fundamentally transform naval warfare and nearly cost Britain everything. On August 4, 1914, when Britain declared war on Germany, the Royal Navy was the most powerful maritime force the world had ever seen. The Grand Fleet boasted 20 dreadnought battleships, 40 cruisers, and 221 destroyers. Its guns outranged anything afloat. Its admirals planned for a decisive battle that would crush the German high seas fleet in a single afternoon, just as Nelson had destroyed the French and Spanish at Trafalgar a century earlier. What they didn't plan for was the submarine. Germany entered the war with just 28 operational U-boats. The German High Command viewed them as coastal defense weapons, experimental curiosities that might harass British ships but could never challenge Britain's mastery of the seas. The German naval construction program had planned for only 72 submarines by 1920, a tiny fraction of their battleship-focused budget. Most German admirals still believed that steel battleships slugging it out in daylight would decide the war at sea. They were catastrophically wrong. On September 5, 1914, just 1 month into the war, U-21 torpedoed and sank HMS Pathfinder, a light cruiser, off the Scottish coast. Pathfinder went down in 4 minutes, taking 259 men with her. It was the first ship in history sunk by submarine using a self-propelled torpedo. The age of underwater warfare had arrived. 3 weeks later came a blow that shocked the British Empire to its core. On September 22, 1914, a single German submarine, U-9, commanded by Kapitän Lieutenant Otto Weddigen, encountered 3 British armoured cruisers patrolling the Dutch coast: HMS Aboukir, HMS Hogue, and HMS Cressy. In just over an hour, Weddigen sank all 3. The cruiser's HMS Aboukir was hit first. When HMS Hogue stopped to pick up survivors, U-9 torpedoed her too. HMS Cressy, believing she was under attack by multiple submarines, also stopped to rescue men from the water. U-9 destroyed her as well. In 75 minutes, 1,459 British sailors died. 3 armoured cruisers, representing thousands of tons of steel and decades of naval expertise, had been sent to the bottom by a 35-man submarine that displaced less than 500 tons. The implications were staggering. If a single U-boat could sink 3 warships in an hour, what could a fleet of them do? The Grand Fleet immediately withdrew from its forward bases to anchorages in the far north of Scotland, effectively ceding control of the southern North Sea to Germany. The submarine had done what no surface fleet could accomplish. It had forced the world's greatest navy to retreat. But that was just the beginning. Initially, U-boats followed what were called cruiser rules or prize rules, international laws governing naval warfare that dated back centuries. Under these rules, a warship had to stop a merchant vessel, inspect its cargo, ensure the crew and passengers got safely into lifeboats, and only then could it sink the ship. These rules assumed combat between surface vessels where both sides could see each other and engage on roughly equal terms. U-boats made those rules obsolete. A submarine surfacing to inspect a merchant ship was vulnerable, exposed on the surface, unable to dive quickly if attacked, equipped with only a small deck gun for defense. And merchant ships increasingly carried concealed weapons specifically designed to sink submarines that came too close. Germany faced a strategic dilemma. Britain had imposed a naval blockade that was slowly starving Germany of food and raw materials. By late 1914, German civilians were facing severe shortages. The High Seas Fleet was too outgunned to break the British blockade in a surface battle. But U-boats offered a way to strike back, to blockade Britain in return, to sink the merchant ships carrying food, ammunition, and raw materials that kept the British war machine running. On February 4, 1915, Germany declared the waters around Britain a war zone, where all ships, merchant, civilian, neutral, would be sunk without warning. It was called unrestricted submarine warfare, and it represented a fundamental break with centuries of naval tradition. No more warnings, no more lifeboats, just torpedoes fired from invisible attackers. The policy was immediately effective. In the first month of unrestricted warfare, U-boats sank 29 ships totaling 89,517 gross registered tons. By summer, they were sinking ships at a rate of 120,000 tons per month. But the policy came with enormous diplomatic costs. On May 7, 1915, Kapitän Lieutenant Walter Schwieger in U-20 torpedoed the Cunard passenger liner RMS Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. The luxury liner sank in just 18 minutes. Of the 1,962 passengers aboard, 1,098 died. including 128 Americans. The sinking caused international outrage. President Woodrow Wilson issued 3 increasingly stern warnings to Germany. Faced with the very real possibility that the United States would enter the war on Britain's side, Kaiser Wilhelm II backed down. On September 18, 1915, Germany suspended unrestricted submarine warfare. For over a year, U-boats returned to following prize rules in most waters. The sinking rate dropped, but remained significant. German submarines continued to take a steady toll, sinking about 350,000 tons per month through late 1915 and 1916. The British merchant marine, which totaled about 21 million gross registered tons at the war's start, could absorb these losses, especially since new construction and captured ships more than replaced what was sunk. But Germany was losing the war on land. The Battle of Verdun had devoured hundreds of thousands of lives without breaking the French. The British Somme offensive, though horrifically costly, had demonstrated that the Allies could sustain massive casualties indefinitely. Germany's allies were collapsing. Austria-Hungary was exhausted. The Ottoman Empire was crumbling. Germany faced a war of attrition it couldn't win. In December 1916, Admiral Henning von Holtzendorf, chief of the German naval staff, composed a memorandum that would change everything. Working from detailed studies of British shipping patterns and import requirements, Holtzendorf calculated that if U-boats could sink 600,000 tons of shipping per month for 6 months, Britain would be forced to surrender. The math was brutal and simple. Britain imported 95% of its food, 100% of its oil, and massive quantities of raw materials. Sink enough ships, and the British population would starve. The British economy would collapse. Britain would have to seek peace before American entry into the war could tip the balance. Germany now had 105 operational U-boats, including new long-range types that could reach the Atlantic shipping lanes. Von Holtzendorf and the German military staff convinced themselves that even if unrestricted warfare brought America into the war, Britain would collapse before American forces could cross the Atlantic in meaningful numbers. It was a gamble, but Germany had run out of alternatives. On January 31, 1917, Kaiser Wilhelm II signed the order. Unrestricted submarine warfare would resume on February 1, 1917. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. In February 1917, U-boats sank 412 tons of Allied shipping. In March, 564,497 tons. In April, 860,334 tons, the highest monthly total of the entire war. By May 1917, 1 in every 4 ships approaching Britain was being sunk. The North Atlantic was becoming a graveyard. Let me put those numbers in perspective. 860,000 tons represented approximately 150 ships in a single month. That's 5 ships every day. Britain was importing about 3 million tons of goods per month in January 1917. By April, that had fallen to barely 2 million tons. If the trend continued, Britain would fall below 1 million tons by October, nowhere near enough to feed the population or supply the army. Admiral John Jellicoe, first Sea Lord of the Admiralty, told the War Cabinet in April 1917, "There is no good discussing plans for next spring. We cannot go on." He meant it literally. At the current rate of losses, Britain would run out of food by November 1917. The British economy would collapse. The war would be lost. And here's the terrifying truth. The Royal Navy had no answer. Minefields sank some U-boats, but submarines could often detect and avoid them. Depth charges existed but were in short supply and difficult to use effectively. You had to know exactly where the submarine was, and most submerged U-boats were invisible. Hydrophones for detecting submarines underwater were primitive and unreliable in 1917. Destroyers and patrol boats hunted U-boats but rarely found them. The vastness of the ocean meant that even hundreds of warships couldn't adequately protect thousands of merchant ships sailing independently across millions of square miles. By early 1917, Germany appeared to have found a war-winning strategy. The U-boat campaign was working. Britain was being slowly strangled. And traditional naval power, all those battleships and cruisers that had made Britain mistress of the seas, was useless against an enemy that attacked from beneath the waves and vanished before retaliation was possible. This was the crisis that demanded desperate solutions. This was the environment that made Q-ships not just acceptable, but necessary. Because when your nation is 6 months from starvation, when an invisible enemy is winning, when conventional weapons have failed, that's when someone suggests the unthinkable. What if we could make the U-boats surface? What if we could lure them close? What if we could turn their own tactics against them? And that's exactly what terrified everyone. The only way to make it work was to use human beings as bait. There was one man who thought differently about the submarine problem, who saw opportunity where others saw only doom. His name was Gordon Campbell, and by February 1917, he had already sunk 2 U-boats using methods that most naval officers considered either brilliant or insane, possibly both. Gordon Campbell was born on January 6, 1886 in Croydon, just south of London. His father, Frederick Campbell, was a civil servant of modest means. Gordon attended Dulwich College from 1898 to 1900, a respectable school but not one of the elite establishments like Eton or Harrow that typically produced Royal Navy admirals. He was intelligent but not wealthy, ambitious but not connected to the naval aristocracy that ran the service. Everything he would achieve, he would earn. In 1900, at age 14, Campbell joined the Royal Navy as a cadet. The decision shaped everything that followed. Naval service in the Edwardian era was hard. Months at sea, brutal discipline, advancement through examination and merit. Campbell thrived. In October 1902, as a midshipman, he was posted to HMS Irresistible, a pre-dreadnought battleship serving in the Mediterranean. For the next 5 years, he learned his trade the traditional way: watchkeeping, navigation, gunnery drills, the endless routines that turned boys into officers. He was promoted to lieutenant in 1907. For the next 9 years, Campbell served without particular distinction, a capable officer doing capable work on a succession of ships. When war broke out in August 1914, Lieutenant Commander Campbell found himself commanding HMS Bittern, an elderly destroyer. Not a plum assignment, not a pathway to glory. Just escort duties, patrol work, the unglamorous routine of keeping the sea lanes open. And Gordon Campbell was bored out of his mind. You have to understand the psychology. Here was an ambitious officer in his late 20s, watching the greatest naval war in history unfold, and his role was to shepherd convoys back and forth across the Irish Sea. Battle cruisers were fighting epic duels. Submarines were changing naval warfare forever, and he was escorting coal ships. So in September 1915, when the Admiralty put out a call for volunteers for special service, work that was classified, dangerous, and offered no promise of promotion, Lieutenant Commander Campbell jumped at it. He had no idea what special service meant. He just knew it had to be more exciting than escort duty. What he discovered was Q-ships. The concept had emerged early in the war out of sheer frustration. When U-boats first began attacking merchant ships in 1914, they followed prize rules: surfacing, ordering the crew to abandon ship, then sinking the vessel with deck gun fire to conserve torpedoes. This gave the Royal Navy an idea. What if a merchant ship wasn't really a merchant ship? What if it was a warship in disguise? The first experiments were crude. The converted fishing trawler Great Gowan sank U-27 in July 1915 by simply having a gun hidden behind a lowered bulwark. When the U-boat surfaced, the crew raised the gun and opened fire. In August 1915, HMS Baralong, disguised as a cargo steamer, sank U-27 off the coast of Ireland. The Baralong incident became infamous because the Q ship's commander, Lieutenant Godfrey Herbert, allegedly ordered his crew to shoot German survivors in the water and on board the merchant ship they'd been attacking. The incident became a propaganda disaster and highlighted the moral gray areas Q ship warfare created. You were asking men to fight in disguise, to lie and deceive, to blur the lines between warships and civilians. It was effective, but it was also disturbing. By late 1915, the Admiralty had developed a systematic approach. They converted about 200 merchant vessels into Q ships, ships that looked like harmless cargo carriers, but concealed heavy armament behind false bulkheads and deck cargo. The crews were all volunteers, mostly Royal Navy regulars who understood what they were getting into. Each ship operated under a merchant name and flag, typically Norwegian or Danish, since those neutral nations' ships operated freely in the war zone. When Campbell volunteered, he was given command of Loderer, an elderly collier built in 1904, a tramp steamer that had spent years hauling coal around British ports. She was renamed HMS Farnborough and designated Q5, but she continued to sail under the name Loderer when on operations. The Admiralty fitted her with 5 12-pounder guns, hidden behind collapsing bulkheads, plus a single small gun mounted openly aft. Since many merchants carried defensive weapons by 1915, a completely unarmed ship would look suspicious. Her cargo holds were filled with wood and cork to make her nearly unsinkable. The armament was carefully hidden. 1 12-pounder was concealed in a fake deck house aft. 2 more were mounted amidships on each side, hidden behind hinged bulwarks that could fall away on command. A Maxim machine gun nested inside what appeared to be a chicken coop behind the funnel. The white ensign, the Royal Navy's battle flag, was kept rolled up, ready to be hoisted the moment the deception ended. Because according to international law, Q ships could only open fire after raising their true colors. Firing while under a false flag would be piracy. Campbell studied the psychology. A U-boat commander approaching a merchant ship would look for specific signs. Does she change course to run? That suggests warship. Does her crew look disciplined and organized? Suspicious. Does she have too much freeboard? How high the hull sits in the water, suggesting she's not actually carrying cargo? Red flag. Campbell had to make Farnborough look, sound, smell, and behave like exactly what she pretended to be. A rust-bucket tramp steamer crewed by slovenly merchant sailors who wanted nothing more than to abandon ship at the first sign of danger. So Campbell Nazalassoti and his officers became actors. When in port, they wore civilian clothes, shabby sweaters, old caps, the kind of outfits actual merchant sailors wore. Campbell grew a beard and deliberately cultivated a rough appearance. His officers did the same. When Farnborough sailed, her crew dressed as merchant seamen. They hung laundry from the rigging. They left deck equipment scattered about carelessly. They practiced looking frightened, and they developed what became known as the panic party. The panic party was the heart of Q-ship tactics. When a U-boat appeared, a pre-selected group of men would rush to a lifeboat in apparent terror, shouting, stumbling, grabbing random belongings. One man famously carried a parrot in a cage to add authenticity. These men would row away from the ship, waving and yelling, doing everything possible to convince the U-boat commander that he'd won. Meanwhile, the gun crews remained hidden, lying flat behind their concealed weapons, forbidden to move no matter what happened. The ship would blow off steam, suggesting engine failure, list to one side, generally behave like a vessel in distress. The psychology was brutal, make the U-boat commander confident enough to surface and approach close enough for hidden guns to shred his submarine before he could dive to safety. But it required patience bordering on madness. Q-ship gun crews had to remain hidden while the submarine shelled their vessel. They had to watch German gunners aim at them and wait for the order to fire. They had to believe their commander would give that order at exactly the right moment, close enough for certain kills, but not so close that the submarine could torpedo them before the guns opened fire. And Gordon Campbell discovered he was very, very good at this particular form of warfare. His first major success came on March 22, 1916, off the west coast of Ireland. At approximately 7 o'clock a.m., U-68, a brand new submarine on only its 6th day of her first war patrol, fired a torpedo at Farnborough. The torpedo missed, passing just ahead of the bow. Campbell maintained course and speed, giving no indication he'd seen it. 20 minutes later, U-68 surfaced about 1,000 yards astern and fired a warning shot across Farnborough's bow. Campbell executed the drill perfectly. Farnborough stopped. Steam vented from her engines with an impressive hiss. The panic party scrambled into a lifeboat and rowed away with admirable displays of terror. U-68's commander, Kapitän Lieutenant Kurt Gunzel, brought his submarine closer, 800 yards, then 600. He was young, inexperienced on his first patrol. He'd never encountered a Q-ship. Everything about Farnborough looked right. The panicked crew, the shabby appearance, the behavior of a genuine merchant in distress. At 800 yards, Campbell gave the order. The white ensign shot up the mast. The fake bulkheads crashed down. 3 12-pounder guns swung into action. Farnborough's gunners were Royal Navy professionals who'd trained for exactly this moment. At 800 yards against a surfaced submarine, they couldn't miss. The first salvo hit U-68's conning tower. The second shredded her pressure hull. Shells rained down at a rate of 5 per minute. 21 rounds fired before U-68 could dive. She settled by the stern, clearly doomed. Campbell steered Farnborough directly over where U-68 had submerged and dropped a Type D depth charge, a 300-pound canister of explosives that detonated at a preset depth. The explosion was so powerful, it blew U-68's bow out of the water momentarily before the submarine plunged to the bottom, taking all 38 of her crew with her. It was the first time depth charges had successfully destroyed a submarine. Campbell was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, but more importantly, he'd proven the concept. Q-ships could work, the tactic could be refined, and Campbell refined it obsessively. He realized that inexperienced U-boat commanders like Gunzel would fall for the deception, but veteran commanders were more cautious. They'd inspect the ship through their periscope for a long time before surfacing. They'd stay at extreme range. They might even fire torpedoes from underwater and never surface at all. Campbell came to a conclusion that seemed insane. To guarantee success, Farnborough needed to get torpedoed. Only a ship visibly sinking, obviously doomed, would draw a cautious U-boat commander close enough for certain destruction. The submarine would surface to finish her off with deck gun fire. Torpedoes were expensive and limited in supply. Why waste one on a ship already sinking? And that's when the trap would spring. His officers thought he'd lost his mind. The Admiralty was skeptical. Even Campbell's own crew had doubts. Yes, Farnborough's holds were packed with wood and cork, but a torpedo could kill men, could start fires, could blow apart bulkheads and flood compartments faster than pumps could handle. Campbell was proposing to deliberately steer into a torpedo hit, to gamble dozens of lives on his belief that they could survive long enough to kill the submarine. But Campbell had thought it through. A torpedo striking the engine room would be catastrophic. That would doom them, but a hit aft or forward away from vital machinery might be survivable. The key was to let the torpedo hit exactly where he wanted. To actually steer into the torpedo, adjusting course at the last second to present the least vulnerable part of the ship to the warhead. By January 1917, Campbell had concluded that this was the only way to guarantee kills. Germany had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. U-boat commanders were more experienced and more cautious. They'd learned about Q-ships and were watching for them. The old tactics wouldn't work anymore. So Campbell prepared Farnborough for her most audacious mission yet. He reinforced bulkheads, improved waterproofing, made sure pumps were positioned to handle flooding. He drilled his crew relentlessly, what to do when torpedoed, how to maintain the deception, when to open fire. and he made clear what he was planning to do. His crew, almost to a man, volunteered to continue serving with him. They'd been through too much together to quit now. They trusted Campbell's judgment, and perhaps more than anything, they wanted another chance at the U-boats that were killing their friends and starving their country. By February 1917, Gordon Campbell had transformed himself from an obscure lieutenant commander doing escort duty into one of the Royal Navy's most unconventional and effective submarine killers. He'd proven that Q-ships could work. He'd shown that with patience, discipline, and a willingness to use his own crew as bait, he could lure U-boats to their deaths. Now he was about to take the tactic to its logical and terrifying extreme. Making Q-ships work required solving problems that seemed insurmountable. Consider what Campbell and his fellow Q-ship commanders faced. First, the logistics. A typical merchant ship carried perhaps 30-40 men. Q-ships needed nearly 70. The panic party, who had to row away convincingly. The gun crews, who remained hidden. The engine room staff, who had to maintain the ship under fire. The bridge crew, who had to act their parts while staying alive. And enough reserves to handle casualties. All these men had to be volunteers, because Q-ship duty wasn't mandatory. You couldn't order men to serve on vessels designed to be shot at while defenseless. Where do you find 70 men willing to stand motionless, while enemy shells explode around them? Second, the acting. A U-boat commander looking through his periscope was watching for anything unusual. Too much smoke from the funnel? Suspicious. Merchant crews were lazy about maintaining boilers. Too little smoke? Also suspicious, suggests a warship trying to hide. Deck cargo stacked too neatly, military thinking. Too messy? Might be fake. Crew moving too crisply. Warship. Too slowly? Possibly faked. Campbell and his officers studied real merchant crews, practiced slouching, rehearsed panic. They had to become merchant sailors at a subconscious level because the slightest wrong move would warn the U-boat away. Third, the weapons. How do you hide 5 naval guns on a merchant ship? The guns had to be completely invisible. No barrels poking through tarpaulins, no gun muzzles visible from any angle. But they also had to be instantly deployable. Campbell's solution was ingenious. The bulwarks and deck structures were hinged on quick-release mechanisms. A single lever would drop the entire false side of the ship, exposing the gun. The crews practiced until they could go from concealed to firing in under 5 seconds. Fourth, the endurance problem. Q-ships had to loiter in U-boat hunting grounds for weeks at a time, zigzagging slowly, looking vulnerable, hoping for contact. This meant sailing alone through the most dangerous waters in the Atlantic, a sitting duck for any U-boat that might appear. Most Q-ship patrols lasted 10 to 14 days. In all that time, they might see nothing. The psychological toll was immense. Constant danger, no action, knowing that at any moment a torpedo might strike without warning. Fifth, the impossible balance between alertness and appearance. The crew had to remain on constant alert. Gun crews sleeping beside their weapons, panic parties ready to scramble at a moment's notice. But they also had to look relaxed when on deck, lounging about like merchant sailors without a care. This cognitive dissonance, hyper-alert internally while appearing casual externally, was exhausting. Sixth, the enemy learned. Early Q-ship successes were relatively straightforward. U-boat surfaces, Q-ship opens fire, U-boat sinks. But by 1916, German naval intelligence had figured out what was happening. They issued warnings to U-boat commanders. Suspicious merchant ships might be Q-ships. The Germans developed counter-tactics, observe longer through the periscope, stay at extreme range, use torpedoes instead of deck guns, watch for any sign of concealed weapons. Some German commanders became convinced that every merchant ship was potentially a Q-ship. This actually helped. Merchant ships were sometimes spared because U-boat commanders were too cautious, but it made Q-ships' job much harder. Seventh, the moral and legal gray areas. Q-ships operated under false flags. Norwegian, Danish, sometimes Dutch. Was this legal? Technically, yes, as long as they raised their true colors, the white ensign, before opening fire. But it created confusion. Neutral ships started being attacked because U-boat commanders couldn't tell real neutrals from Q-ships. The Baralong incident in August 1915, where a Q-ship crew allegedly killed German survivors, raised questions about whether this type of warfare brought out the worst in men. Fighting in disguise, using deception as a primary weapon, required a different moral calculus than traditional naval combat. Eighth, the tactical limitation. Even if everything went perfectly, Q-ship found a U-boat, maintained deception, opened fire at point-blank range. Success wasn't guaranteed. A submarine could dive in under 30 seconds if her hatches were already open. If the first salvo didn't hit something vital, the U-boat might escape damaged but alive. And a damaged U-boat was incredibly hard to finish off. Depth charges were still new technology in 1916-1917. Most didn't work reliably. Unless the Q-ship's gunfire destroyed the submarine's ability to dive, she might slip away to safety. Ninth, the casualties. Q-ships were not armored. When a U-boat's 88mm or 105mm deck gun opened fire, shells went through the hull like paper. Q-ship crews had to stand there and take it, to absorb casualties without flinching, because the moment they fired back too early, the deception ended and the submarine would dive. By the war's end, 2738 Q-ships, sources vary, were sunk out of about 200 deployed. That's a casualty rate of 15/20, extraordinarily high by naval standards. 10th, and perhaps most psychologically demanding, the whole strategy depended on making yourself a target. Traditional naval doctrine said to avoid enemy fire, use speed and maneuver, strike from unexpected angles. Q-ship doctrine said the opposite. Be where the enemy expects you, look vulnerable, invite attack. It went against every instinct. Campbell was asking his crews to suppress their survival reflexes, to stand still while under fire, to watch torpedoes coming and do nothing. Most commanders thought it was impossible. Even many who tried Q-ship command failed. They couldn't maintain the nerve, couldn't resist opening fire too early, couldn't sell the deception convincingly enough. But Campbell had a plan that he believed could work. It was audacious, it was dangerous, and it required a level of trust between commander and crew that was almost unprecedented in naval warfare. His insight was this: U-boat commanders weren't stupid. They knew about Q-ships by 1917. They were watching for deception. The only way to make them surface within gun range was to make the deception so complete, so convincing, that they couldn't possibly believe it was faked. And the only scenario convincing enough was if the ship was genuinely, visibly, catastrophically doomed. Not faking distress, actually sinking. That meant getting torpedoed, deliberately, and surviving. Campbell calculated that if a torpedo struck Farnborough in the right place, aft of the engine room but forward of the rudder, the ship would take massive damage but remain afloat long enough to complete the mission. The wood and cork in her holds would keep her buoyant, the pumps could slow the flooding, and the U-boat commander, seeing a ship clearly going down, would surface to finish her off with gunfire, saving his remaining torpedoes for other targets. It was an enormous gamble. Campbell was risking his reputation, his career, everything. If it failed, if the torpedo hit the wrong spot, if Farnborough sank too quickly, if the pumps couldn't handle the flooding, if the crew panicked, then he'd be court-martialed for deliberately endangering his ship and men. But he'd run the calculations. He'd studied the tactic from every angle. He'd discussed it with his officers, who'd agreed it was the only way to guarantee a kill against an experienced U-boat commander. And, crucially, his crew had voted to support him. Every single man on Farnborough understood what Campbell was planning and agreed to participate. That level of trust is almost unimaginable. Campbell was asking 70 men to stand on a ship while he deliberately steered it into a torpedo. To trust that he'd calculated correctly, to trust that the damage would be survivable, to trust that even while sinking, they'd maintain discipline long enough to destroy the enemy. It was insane. It was brilliant. And on February 17th, 1917, Gordon Campbell was about to find out if it would work. Farnborough left Queenstown, now Cove, Ireland, on February 14th, 1917, sailing under the Norwegian flag as the merchant steamer Loderer. Her course took her into the western approaches, the sea lanes southwest of Ireland where Atlantic convoys passed and where U-boats hunted in wolf-pack density. The weather was miserable. February in the North Atlantic is brutal, freezing spray, howling winds, gray skies that blend seamlessly with gray water. Farnborough wallowed along at 8 knots, her coal-streaked sides and rust-stained hull the picture of merchant despair. Campbell stood on the bridge wearing a shabby civilian coat, his beard whipped by the wind. To any observer, he looked like a merchant captain enduring another routine voyage, counting the days until he could reach port, collect his pay, and find a warm pub. Below that shabby exterior, every man on the ship was tensed like a coiled spring. The gun crews stood watch in 4-hour rotations, never more than seconds away from their weapons. The panic party's members wore their oldest clothes, tattered sweaters, mismatched coats, the kind of gear that suggested merchant sailors scraping by on low wages. Each man had rehearsed his role dozens of times. Which boat he'd run to, what random possession he'd grab, to suggest panic rather than organized abandonment. How he'd stumble and shout to sell the fear. The engine room crew had special instructions. If a torpedo hit, they'd immediately vent steam through external pipes, creating dramatic clouds that would suggest catastrophic damage and mask the crew still hidden on deck. They'd also manipulate the ship's list, the angle at which she leaned to one side, to suggest progressive flooding. Every detail mattered. A ship sinking slowly but steadily was more convincing than one that suddenly rolled over. For 3 days, Farnborough saw nothing. She zigzagged through her patrol area, maintaining the fiction of a nervous merchant master trying to avoid submarines. They passed other merchant ships, exchanged flag signals, waved from the deck. Any U-boat watching through a periscope would see exactly what they expected. One more rust-bucket collier hauling coal across the Atlantic. On the evening of February 16th, Farnborough's wireless operator intercepted distress calls from ships being attacked 40 miles to the east. A U-boat, possibly several, was operating in the area. Campbell altered course slightly, placing Farnborough in the U-boat's likely patrol path. Then they waited. Dawn on February 17th came cold and gray. Visibility was good, several miles, but the overcast sky flattened the light, making it hard to spot a periscope in the choppy water. Campbell had the crew maintain their routines. Men appeared on deck, stretched, scratched, smoked. The cook brought breakfast to the bridge. Campbell made sure the U-boat would see them eating, another sign of a casual merchant crew. Below decks, other men crouched beside hidden guns, every sense alert. At 9:40 a.m., a lookout spotted something. A white wake cutting through the gray water, arrow straight, moving fast. Campbell marked its bearing and did the mental calculation instantly. The torpedo was on a collision course with Farnborough, fired from extreme range, perhaps 600 or 700 yards, by a U-boat commander who was being very, very careful. This was the moment. Everything Campbell had planned came down to the next 30 seconds. He could turn Farnborough away from the torpedo track, an easy maneuver that would cause the torpedo to miss cleanly. But that would tell the U-boat commander he'd been spotted. U-83 would dive and slip away. Months of preparation would evaporate in an instant. Or he could do what he'd planned, what he'd convinced his crew to trust him to do, what seemed to violate every rule of seamanship and self-preservation. Campbell adjusted Farnborough's course very slightly, not away from the torpedo, but to ensure it would strike aft, in the area between the engine room and the stern, where he'd calculated the damage would be survivable. He was aiming his own ship at a torpedo warhead. Around him on the bridge, his officers watched in frozen silence. Every man could see the torpedo wake now, a white line of bubbles and disturbed water, growing closer with terrifying speed. Campbell's hands gripped the rail. His face was expressionless. He'd committed to the course. At 9:52 a.m., the torpedo struck. The explosion lifted Farnborough's stern out of the water. The blast was enormous, 400 pounds of high explosive detonating against the hull plates. Steel screamed, rivets sheared, the deck bucked, men were thrown from their feet. In the engine room, the shock wave hammered through the hull with a sound like the end of the world. But Campbell had calculated correctly. The torpedo struck almost exactly where he'd intended, aft of the engine room, punching a massive hole in the hull but not destroying the ship's ability to function. Water thundered into the stern compartments. The ship immediately took on a list to port, settling deeper by the stern. It looked catastrophic. It felt catastrophic. It was survivable. Barely. "Panic party away!" Campbell's voice cut through the chaos. The pre-selected men, 12 of them, erupted from below decks in a performance honed by endless rehearsal. They didn't run in formation. They scattered, shouting, stumbling, some without coats despite the freezing weather. One man grabbed a canvas bag, another dragged what appeared to be a sea chest. A third carried the stuffed parrot in its cage, a touch Campbell had insisted on for authenticity. They scrambled into 2 lifeboats, launched them in barely controlled chaos, and rowed away frantically, shouting to each other in Norwegian. The performance had to be perfect. Through his periscope, U-83's commander, Captain Lieutenant Bruno Hopper, was watching everything. Any wrong detail would spook him. The men in the boats had to look genuinely terrified. Their rowing had to be ragged, panicked, not the synchronized strokes of trained Navy men. They had to glance back at their ship with the expressions of men who'd just lost everything. Meanwhile, on Farnborough's deck, the rest of the crew enacted the second phase of the deception. Several men appeared at the rails, waving at the boats, then disappeared. Steam vented from the engine room in great hissing clouds, the engineers executing their role perfectly, creating visual evidence of catastrophic damage. The ship's list increased as internal pumps quietly moved water to ballast tanks on the port side. Within minutes, Farnborough was lying 10 degrees to port, her stern noticeably lower, smoke and steam rising from multiple locations. She looked doomed, and the crucial thing was, she was genuinely severely damaged. Campbell wasn't faking the sinking. Water was flooding the aft compartments at an alarming rate. The ship was going down. The deception worked because it was barely a deception at all. Below decks and behind the hidden bulkheads, 58 men remained. They lay flat on the deck beside their guns. They pressed themselves against bulkheads. They stayed absolutely motionless. Every one of them knew that a periscope was watching. Any movement, any shadow that looked wrong, any glimpse of a gun barrel, any sign that too many men remained aboard would end the operation. And so they waited, while their ship sank beneath them, while water continued pouring into the stern, while the list increased and the deck began angling underfoot. They waited. This was the psychological crucible. Time stretches in moments like this. Seconds feel like minutes. Minutes feel like hours. You're lying flat on a wet deck. Your ship is sinking. You can hear water rushing into the hull below you. You don't know if the U-boat has bought the deception. You don't know if it will surface or just fire another torpedo to finish the job. You don't know if your commander's calculations were right, if the ship will stay afloat long enough, if the pumps can handle the flooding. All you can do is lie there and trust. For 30 minutes, nothing happened. The panic party rowed their boats in wide circles, maintaining the fiction of terrified merchant sailors unsure what to do. They stayed about 200 yards from Farnborough, close enough that they'd be visible through the periscope, but far enough that they wouldn't interfere with what came next. Aboard Farnborough, Campbell stood on the bridge, his body angled so he could watch the water without appearing to look anywhere in particular. The ship was settling deeper. Water was now visible sloshing on the main deck in some areas. The engineers reported that flooding was controlled but serious. They had maybe an hour, possibly two, before Farnborough would sink even if undisturbed. Every minute that passed was a minute closer to the point of no return. But Campbell held firm. No orders, no signals, just waiting. Because he knew what Kapitän Lieutenant Hopp was doing, watching through the periscope, checking every detail, looking for anything wrong. The U-boat commander could see that Farnborough was sinking, but was she a merchant or was she a Q-ship? That was the question Hopp was trying to answer. And the longer Farnborough survived without doing anything suspicious, the more convinced he'd become that she was genuine. At 10:22 a.m., exactly 30 minutes after the torpedo strike, U-83 surfaced. She came up about 300 yards off Farnborough's port quarter. The submarine broke through the grey water like a surfacing whale, conning tower first, then the deck, then the long, low hull. Water cascaded from her sides. Her deck gun, an 88 mm weapon, was already manned. German sailors appeared on the conning tower, scanning Farnborough through binoculars. Campbell watched from the corner of his eye. He showed no reaction. Around him, his bridge crew maintained their roles. A few men visible at the rails, looking at the U-boat with apparent fear, then ducking away. Not running, not panicking now, just frightened men watching their doom approach. U-83 closed slowly. Hopp was still being careful. His deck gun tracked Farnborough, ready to fire if anything looked wrong. His submarine approached at an angle that would let him dive quickly if needed. He was watching for the slightest false move. 200 yards. Farnborough continued settling by the stern, listing further to port. She looked barely afloat. Men were visible in the lifeboats, watching this U-boat approach. On Farnborough's deck, a few figures moved aimlessly, apparently too shocked to abandon ship properly. Everything looked exactly right. 150 yards. U-83 was nearly parallel to Farnborough now, on her port side. Through the U-boat's deck gun sight, German gunners could see individual details of the sinking ship, the rust, the cargo markings, the general air of shabby disrepair. This was no warship. This was a merchant collier, torpedoed and going down, her crew scattered and helpless. 100 yards. Campbell could see German faces now. Kapitän Lieutenant Hopp stood in the conning tower, binoculars raised. The deck gun crew trained their weapon on Farnborough's bridge. In the lifeboats, the panic party members watched with frozen expressions, and Campbell waited. Because 100 yards was good, but it wasn't perfect. U-83 could still dive if alarmed. Her crew could scramble below in 25 seconds. The first moments after the guns opened fire would be chaos. Gun smoke, shell fire, men moving. If U-83 was too far away, she might escape even if badly damaged. So Campbell waited, while his ship sank, while a German submarine closed for the kill, while 58 men lay hidden around him, every nerve stretched to breaking point. 90 yards. Then 80. U-83 was incredibly close now. Campbell could hear German voices calling to each other. The U-boat was almost directly abeam, the worst possible angle for diving quickly, the best possible position for Farnborough's guns. And that's when Kapitän Lieutenant Hopp made his fatal mistake. He ordered his deck gun crew to open fire. To finish off this helpless merchant with artillery, saving his remaining torpedoes. His men swung the 88mm gun around to target Farnborough's waterline, aiming to punch more holes in the sinking ship and speed her end. Campbell spoke 2 words: open fire. Everything happened at once. The white ensign shot up Farnborough's mast. False bulkheads crashed down along the ship's side, hinged sections that had appeared to be solid hull dropping away to reveal gun barrels. 5 12-pounder guns swung toward U-83, and 58 men who'd been lying motionless for 30 minutes leaped to their weapons with synchronized precision. The first salvo fired at 10:25 a.m. from a range of 75 yards, point blank by naval standards. Campbell's gunners were among the best in the Royal Navy, trained to an edge sharper than razors, veterans who'd rehearsed this exact scenario dozens of times. They couldn't miss. They didn't miss. The first shell hit U-83's conning tower and decapitated Kapitän-Leutnant Hopper where he stood. The second smashed through the deck casing near the deck gun. The third penetrated the pressure hull. Shells were hitting U-83 faster than her crew could react. A 5-round-per-minute rate of fire from multiple guns, each shell a 12-pound projectile of hardened steel and explosive. On U-83's deck, chaos erupted. Men scrambled for the hatches. The deck gun crew abandoned their weapon. Someone was, shouting orders, but no one could hear over the screaming of shells and the explosions. Steel shattered. The conning tower was a wreck. Holes appeared in the pressure hull, the submarine's death sentence. Water began pouring in. Campbell stood on Farnborough's bridge watching through binoculars, his voice calm, giving corrections to the gun crews. Target the waterline. Good. Again. Again. His ship was still sinking, water sloshing across the main deck now, list increasing, but that didn't matter anymore. They had seconds to finish this. 45 rounds fired in less than 4 minutes. U-83's deck was a shambles of twisted metal and broken bodies. Her conning tower looked like it had been hit by a sledgehammer. The pressure hull was breached in multiple places, and critically, her hatches, the only way to close the submarine and dive, were jammed or blocked by wreckage. At 10:29 a.m., 4 minutes after opening fire, U-83 began to sink. Not slowly, like a controlled dive, but catastrophically. Her stern lifted as water flooded the forward compartments. Men tried to escape through the mangled hatches, but there wasn't time. The submarine's bow tilted down at an impossible angle. She was going. Campbell ordered ceasefire. There was no point in shooting anymore. U-83 was finished. Around him, his gun crews stood at their weapons, watching the submarine's death throes with grim satisfaction. These were professional sailors. They took no joy in killing, but they'd sunk a U-boat, one fewer submarine to murder merchant sailors, one fewer threat to Britain's lifeline. U-83's stern rose higher. The submarine was nearly vertical in the water, bow pointing straight down. A few German sailors had managed to reach the deck and dove into the freezing water. Then, with a horrible grinding sound, U-83 slipped beneath the waves, pulling down the men who couldn't get clear. Silence fell across the grey water. Just the slap of waves against Farnborough's sinking hull, the smoke from the guns drifting away, and 8 men in the water, swimming frantically toward the lifeboats. Campbell's boats rowed toward them. They pulled 2 survivors from the water, 2 men out of U-83's crew of 35. One died within hours. The other survivor, too traumatized to speak coherently, was the only man from U-83 who would live to see the end of the war. But there was no time to celebrate, because Farnborough was genuinely sinking now, and the torpedo damage was worse than Campbell had calculated. The ship had taken on an extreme list, nearly 20 degrees to port. The stern was underwater. Water was flooding forward into compartments that should have been safe. The pumps were losing the battle. Without immediate help, Farnborough would go down within the hour, and 60 exhausted men would find themselves swimming in the North Atlantic in February. Campbell sent urgent wireless calls for assistance. Then he turned to the grim work of keeping his ship afloat. The engineering crew performed miracles, shoring up bulkheads, redirecting pumps, sealing passages. The deck crew jettisoned everything they could to reduce weight. The afterdeck was now completely submerged. Men worked in waist-deep water in some compartments, freezing, exhausted, but driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death. At 2:30 p.m., 5 hours after the torpedo hit, 2 sloops appeared on the horizon, HMS Crocus and HMS Zinnia. They closed quickly, launched boats, and began transferring men from Farnborough. Campbell stayed aboard with the skeleton crew, trying to keep the ship from capsizing long enough to get a tow attached. But Farnborough was dying. At one point, a depth charge, shaken loose by the list, exploded underwater near the hull, causing additional damage and nearly finishing her. Campbell ordered everyone off except himself and his first officer, Lieutenant Ronald Stewart, who refused to leave until his captain did. They got a tow line attached. HMS Crocus began pulling Farnborough toward Queenstown, 90 miles away. For 16 hours, the barely floating wreck limped across the Irish Sea. The engineers had rigged emergency pumps, and every man not rowing the tow helped bail by hand. Farnborough was under 8 feet of water in places, listing so severely that her deck was nearly vertical amidships. But she stayed afloat, just barely. At dawn on February 18th, tugs from Queenstown took over the tow and guided Farnborough into Mill Cove, a small bay south of Cork Harbour, where she was deliberately beached in the shallows. She settled into the mud, listing at 25 degrees, her stern completely submerged, looking more like a shipwreck than a functioning vessel. Campbell stood on the canted deck and watched his ship settle. She'd survived. His crew had survived. And U-83 hadn't. The results were concrete and devastating to German U-boat operations. U-83 had gone down with 33 of her 35 crew, including her commander. She'd been on only her 6th war patrol, part of Germany's newest generation of improved submarines. Her loss represented not just the submarine itself, worth hundreds of thousands of marks, but the trained crew that couldn't be easily replaced. Training U-boat commanders took months. Germany couldn't afford to lose experienced men at this rate. But the casualty figures, grim as they were, tell only part of the story. Each of those 33 men represented a person, sons, brothers, husbands. The German submarine service was tight-knit. Crews knew each other across different boats. When U-83 failed to return to base, it sent ripples of unease through the U-boat arm. The mystery ships were real. The danger was real. That merchant ship could be a death trap. For Britain, Campbell's victory came at a critical moment. February 1917 had been catastrophic. 520,000 tons sunk, with worse expected in March. Every U-boat removed from service mattered. U-83 would sink no more ships. She wouldn't participate in the April offensive that nearly broke Britain's back. She was gone, and her loss was entirely due to Campbell's audacity and his crew's discipline. The immediate strategic consequences were clear. Q-ships worked, but at a terrible cost. Farnborough was out of action for months. Her damage was so severe that salvaging her took weeks, and repairs would require major dockyard work. Her crew was exhausted, traumatized by the experience of being deliberately torpedoed. Several men requested transfer to other duties. The psychological strain had been too much. But Campbell's reception was immediate and overwhelming. Admiral Lewis Bailey, commanding officer of the Queenstown base, sent a simple message. "Very good piece of work. Well done." Coming from Bailey, a notoriously hard-to-impress officer, this was extraordinary praise. The Admiralty agreed. On March 7, 1917, less than 3 weeks after the action, King George V presented Gordon Campbell with the Victoria Cross at Buckingham Palace. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry, consummate coolness, and skill in command of one of His Majesty's ships in action." The £1,000 in prize money was divided among the 40 surviving crew members, a substantial sum, equivalent to about 2 years' wages for an ordinary seaman. Lieutenant Stewart and Engineer Lieutenant Len Lovelace each received the Distinguished Service Order. 24 other crew members received mentions and dispatches. It was one of the most decorated single actions of the naval war. But Campbell knew the truth that lay behind the celebration. They'd been incredibly lucky. If the torpedo had struck 10 feet further forward, Farnborough's engine room would have flooded and the ship would have sunk before U-83 surfaced. If Hop had been more cautious, if he'd stayed at 200 yards instead of closing to 75, U-83 might have escaped even after being hit. If the depth charge hadn't accidentally exploded during the tow, Maybe Farnborough would have made it back to port under her own power instead of barely surviving. The line between success and disaster had been razor thin, and Campbell had walked that line by deliberately getting his ship torpedoed. Still, the victory proved something crucial. The tactic could work. Against a cautious, experienced U-boat commander in 1917. In the era of unrestricted submarine warfare, when U-boats had learned to be wary, a well-executed Q-ship operation could still achieve kills. It required nerve, perfect timing, extraordinary discipline, and a willingness to accept casualties. But it was possible. Word spread through the Royal Navy. Campbell had proven that Q-ships weren't obsolete, that the tactic could be refined to meet the new challenges, and that there were men willing to serve on these death traps if led by commanders who knew what they were doing. Within weeks, Campbell had been promoted to commander and given another Q-ship, a 3,000-ton tramp steamer originally called Victoria, briefly renamed HMS Snail, then finally designated HMS Pargust. Most of Farnborough's crew volunteered to follow him. They'd seen the method work. They trusted Campbell's judgment, and they wanted another chance at the U-boats. The psychological impact on the U-boat service is harder to quantify, but was very real. German naval intelligence compiled detailed reports on Q-ships, warning commanders to watch for specific signs: ships that looked too seaworthy, crews that seemed too disciplined, vessels that didn't quite behave right. Some U-boat commanders became so cautious they'd refuse to surface even when attacking clearly doomed ships, wasting precious torpedoes rather than risk approaching close. This actually helped Britain even when Q-ships weren't involved. If U-boat commanders were more cautious, they sank fewer ships. If they wasted torpedoes on ships that might have been finished with gunfire, they had to return to base sooner to reload. If they spent extra time observing potential targets through periscopes, they encountered fewer ships per patrol. The psychological warfare aspect of Q-ships, making every merchant ship potentially dangerous, may have saved more tonnage than the direct sinkings. But the human cost was never far from anyone's mind. 24,000 casualties on both sides from Q-ship operations over the course of the war. Each represented a person who died in this strange, intimate form of combat. Q-ship warfare was brutal, not despite its personal nature, but because of it. You looked your enemy in the eye. You deceived them deliberately. You used every psychological trick to make them trust you, then you killed them at point-blank range. It was effective, but it was also deeply unsettling. Campbell understood this better than most. He'd seen Kapitän Leutnant Hoppe's face through his binoculars in the instant before the first shell struck. He'd watched German sailors scramble for their lives as their submarine broke apart under sustained fire. He'd pulled 2 half-frozen men from the water, knowing that 31 of their shipmates were gone forever. There was no glory in this, Campbell knew. Just necessity. Britain was fighting for survival. The U-boats were winning. Q-ships offered a way to fight back, and Gordon Campbell would fight back with every tool at his disposal, regardless of the cost to himself or his crew. But the immediate aftermath of the U-83 action also brought a grim realization. Campbell had proven that deliberately getting torpedoed could work, which meant that the Admiralty would expect him to do it again and again, until his luck ran out, or his nerve broke, or a torpedo hit the wrong spot and killed him and everyone aboard. It was a death sentence, delivered slowly, 1 patrol at a time, and Campbell accepted it without complaint, because that's what duty required. But the true significance of Campbell's victories and the Q-ship program as a whole went beyond immediate celebrations. The impact rippled outward across multiple scales, changing not just tactics, but strategy, not just individual battles, but the entire course of the naval war. First, the immediate tactical level. Every U-boat sunk by a Q-ship was 1 fewer submarine stalking the Atlantic sea lanes. By the end of the war, Q-ships had destroyed between 12 and 15 U-boats. Sources vary on attribution for several kills. This sounds modest, Germany operated 351 U-boats during World War I, and 178 were eventually destroyed by all means. Q-ships accounted for perhaps 7–8% of U-boat losses. But context matters. Those 12 to 15 submarines would have continued operating for months or years. A typical U-boat could sink 30–40 merchant ships during its career. If Q-ships removed even 12 U-boats from service permanently, they prevented potentially 400–500 merchant ship sinkings. That's hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping saved, thousands of sailors' lives preserved, months of food and ammunition delivered to Britain. Second, the strategic theater impact. Q-ships forced changes in German U-boat doctrine. By mid-1916, German naval intelligence had identified Q-ships as a threat and issued new standing orders. U-boat commanders were instructed to be more cautious when approaching merchant ships, to observe longer through periscopes, to prefer torpedo attacks over surfacing, to use deck guns. This made U-boats less efficient overall. If a submarine had to use torpedoes instead of cheap artillery shells, it could sink fewer ships per patrol. If it had to spend more time observing each target, it encountered fewer ships per day. The British Admiralty noted this change. By late 1916, the average number of ships sunk per U-boat per patrol had declined noticeably from earlier periods. Not dramatically, German submarines were still devastatingly effective, but measurably. And in a war of attrition, where Britain's survival depended on maintaining minimum shipping tonnage, even small reductions in U-boat efficiency mattered enormously. Third, the impact on national power dynamics. Q-ships demonstrated that Britain wasn't helpless against the submarine threat. This mattered for morale. In early 1917, when U-boats were sinking ships at a catastrophic rate, when defeat seemed imminent, every Q-ship success was reported to boost public morale. Yes, the Admiralty kept many details secret. The existence of Q-ships wasn't fully revealed until late in the war, but they released enough information to show that Britain was fighting back, that sailors were finding ways to kill U-boats, that the submarine menace could be countered. Fourth, the continental power shift. Q-ships bought time. Time for Britain to implement the convoy system, which ultimately defeated the U-boat offensive. Time for the United States to enter the war and bring fresh resources. Time for anti-submarine technologies, depth charges, hydrophones, improved mines to be developed and deployed. Q-ships weren't the solution to the U-boat problem, but they were part of the solution, and they helped Britain survive the critical months of early 1917 when the U-boat offensive threatened to force a surrender. Consider the counterfactual. What if Q-ships hadn't existed? Would those 12 to 15 U-boats have sunk enough additional shipping to push Britain over the edge? Probably not by themselves. But the margins were so thin in 1917 that even small changes could have mattered. If German submarines had been 10% more efficient because they never had to worry about Q-ships, if they'd sunk an additional 100,000 tons per month, Britain might have fallen below the critical threshold where the civilian economy collapsed. Fifth, the century-long ripple effects. Q-ships established precedents for maritime deception that influenced World War II and beyond. The concept of disguised warships hunting submarines appeared again in World War II, though with less success. U-boats had learned. The psychological principles, using deception to negate enemy advantages, accepting casualties to achieve surprise, influenced special operations thinking throughout the 20th century. Gordon Campbell's willingness to deliberately endanger his ship to achieve mission success foreshadowed modern special operations doctrine, where calculated risk-taking is standard practice. Sixth, the political consequences. Campbell's Victoria Cross and his later book, My Mystery Ships, published in 1929, helped shape public understanding of the naval war. The Q-ship story, brave volunteers and disguised ships fighting against impossible odds, fit perfectly into Britain's preferred narrative of World War I. It was David versus Goliath, clever tactics defeating superior technology, British pluck and ingenuity winning out. This narrative helped Britain process the horror and loss of the war by focusing on examples of heroism and success rather than the grinding attrition that characterized most of the conflict. Seventh, the military institutional impact. Q-ship operations demonstrated the value of unconventional warfare and special operations. Campbell and his fellow Q-ship commanders weren't following traditional naval doctrine. They were improvising, innovating, accepting risks that conventional officers would reject. Their success validated the idea that sometimes you need to break the rules to win. This lesson influenced British military thinking between the wars and contributed to the creation of organizations like the Special Operations Executive in WFU. Eighth, the economic impact. By saving even hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping, Q-ships helped Britain maintain minimum import levels during the critical months of 1917. This wasn't enough by itself to prevent hardship. Rationing was introduced, civilians went hungry, but it kept Britain in the fight long enough for the convoy system to be implemented. And convoys worked. Of 88,000 ships that crossed the Atlantic in convoys during the war, only 436 were sunk, a loss rate below 0.5%, dramatically better than the 25% loss rate for independent ships in early 1917. Ninth, the cultural ripple. Q-ship stories entered popular culture and influenced how later generations understood WWI naval warfare. The image of disguised ships, brave crews, psychological warfare at sea became embedded in the British cultural memory of the war. It provided a counterpoint to the grim images of trench warfare, showing that not all of WWE was mindless slaughter, that sometimes clever tactics and brave individuals could make a difference. 10th, the human legacy. Campbell went on to have a distinguished career, eventually reaching the rank of Vice Admiral. He commanded the battle cruiser HMS Tiger, served as naval aide-de-camp to King George V, and later served as a member of Parliament. But more importantly, his example inspired other officers. The idea that junior commanders could innovate, could take calculated risks, could win against the odds. This became part of Royal Navy culture. Campbell showed that initiative and courage could overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. The cumulative effect of Q-ship operations was greater than their direct impact suggests. Yes, they sank only 12 to 15 U-boats out of 178 total German submarine losses. But they changed how U-boats operated. They forced Germany to be more cautious. They bought Britain time to implement convoys. They demonstrated that the submarine threat wasn't invincible. And they provided examples of extraordinary courage that helped sustain British morale during the darkest days of the war. Without Q-ships, Britain probably would have survived. The convoy system alone would likely have been enough. But the margins were so thin, the crisis so severe, that Q-ships' contribution mattered. They were part of a larger system of anti-submarine measures that collectively saved Britain from defeat. And the men who served on them, knowing the risks, accepting the dangers, volunteering for missions that violated every survival instinct, deserve to be remembered as among the bravest sailors who ever lived. So why has the Q-ship story and Gordon Campbell's extraordinary courage faded from popular memory? Why do most people today know about U-boats and the Battle of the Atlantic, but not about the disguised ships that hunted them? The reasons are numerous and interconnected. First, the complexity of the context. Understanding Q-ships requires understanding submarine warfare, international maritime law, the intricacies of the U-boat campaign, British import requirements, and the desperate strategic situation in early 1917. It's not a simple story. Unlike a straightforward battle, Trafalgar, Jutland, where two fleets met and fought, Q-ship operations were subtle, psychological, layered with deception and moral ambiguity. This complexity makes Q-ships harder to explain and harder for popular memory to retain. People remember simple narratives, Nelson at Trafalgar, Churchill's finest hour. Q-ships require nuance. Second, they weren't the final decisive moment. Q-ships helped, But they didn't win the anti-submarine war. Convoys won that war. By late 1917, it was clear that grouping merchant ships together and protecting them with warships reduced losses to acceptable levels. Q-ships had their moment in 1916-1917, but once convoys proved effective, Q-ship operations declined in importance. History tends to remember the decisive factor, not the supporting elements. Convoys get credit for defeating the U-boats. Q-ships are footnoted. Third, geographic and cultural distance. Most Q-ship operations occurred in the western approaches and Irish Sea, away from the major fleet bases, away from where the Grand Fleet operated, away from the public eye. When Farnborough sank U-83, there were no photographers present, no journalists, no witnesses except the crew. The action happened in grey water under grey skies 90 miles from land. By contrast, battles like Jutland, fought in daylight with hundreds of ships, generated dramatic visuals that stuck in public memory. Q-ship warfare was intimate, small-scale, and secret. It's harder to mythologize something that was deliberately hidden from view. Fourth, they were overshadowed by later events. World War II repeated many of the themes of WWE, but on a larger scale. The Battle of the Atlantic in Wabiput was even more desperate, lasted longer, involved more ships and submarines. The Wabiput U-boat campaign sank more tonnage than WWE's. When people think about submarine warfare now, they usually think of Wabuaku, the wolf packs, the escort carriers, the long struggle from 1939 to 1945. WWI submarine warfare gets compressed into the Lusitania and maybe a vague awareness that U-boats were a problem. Q-ships, operating in the less remembered WWI, get doubly forgotten. Fifth, changing scales of warfare. By Wabuapu, individual actions by single ships, like Campbell's sinking of U-83, seemed less significant in a war where thousands of ships crossed the Atlantic and hundreds of submarines prowled the seas. The scale had expanded. A single U-boat sinking mattered less when Germany would eventually operate over 1,000 U-boats in World War II. The intimate, personal nature of Q-ship warfare, one disguised ship versus one submarine, belonged to an earlier, smaller-scale era of combat. As warfare became more industrial, more total, the Q-ship story started to feel like a relic from a different age. Sixth, the moral ambiguity. Q-ships operated in an ethical gray zone. They fought under false flags. They used deception as their primary weapon. The Baralong incident, where Q-ship crew allegedly killed German survivors, raised disturbing questions about whether this type of warfare brought out the worst in men. After both world wars, there was a tendency to suppress stories that complicated the narrative of righteous warfare. Q-ships, with their deception and disguise, didn't fit neatly into preferred post-war narratives that emphasized British courage and German aggression. The reality was more complex. Both sides used ruthless tactics. Both sides bent rules. Both sides made moral compromises in pursuit of victory. Seventh, the quiet heroism paradox. Q-ship warfare required extraordinary courage of a particular type. Passive courage, the courage to stand still while under fire, to remain hidden while your ship is being destroyed, to suppress every survival instinct. This is harder to dramatize than active courage, charging into battle, leading an attack, dramatic action. Campbell's most heroic moment was when he stood on the bridge and watched a torpedo coming toward his ship and did nothing. That takes immense courage, but it's courage that manifests as stillness, as patience, as discipline. It's less visually dramatic than a cavalry charge or a dogfight. Popular memory tends to favor active heroism over passive heroism. Despite these factors, military historians have never forgotten. Professional naval historians recognize Q-ships as a fascinating case study in unconventional warfare, in the psychology of deception, in the limits of technology, and the importance of human factors in combat. Campbell's methods are still studied in staff colleges. his willingness to take calculated risks, to innovate tactically, to lead by example. These remain relevant lessons. The U.S. Naval Institute published detailed analyses of Q-ship tactics in its proceedings. British naval histories give Q-ships prominent coverage. Submarine warfare specialists understand that Q-ships, while not decisive, were part of the complex system of measures that defeated the U-boat threat. In professional military circles, Gordon Campbell is remembered as one of the great submarine hunters, a man whose courage and tactical genius deserve to rank with any naval hero. But professional military memory and popular memory are different things. The public remembers broad strokes, the Somme, Verdun, the trenches, mustard gas, Jutland. The details, like Q-ships, like Campbell's extraordinary courage, fade from view. They get lost in the overwhelming scope of World War I, a conflict so vast, so consuming, so filled with horror that individual stories often disappear beneath the weight of statistical casualties. And perhaps there's another reason. Q-ship warfare reminds us of uncomfortable truths about war. It shows us that survival sometimes requires deception, that winning sometimes demands accepting friendly casualties to kill the enemy, that courage sometimes looks like standing still while explosives tear your ship apart. These truths don't fit comfortably into preferred narratives about warfare as a noble enterprise. They remind us that war is complex, morally ambiguous, and often demands impossible choices from ordinary people. Gordon Campbell faced an impossible choice on February 17, 1917, and he made it, and 58 men trusted him enough to stand beside hidden guns while a torpedo struck their ship, while water flooded into the hull, while they waited for a U-boat to surface close enough to kill. That's the kind of courage that deserves to be remembered. Even if, especially if, it makes us uncomfortable to remember it. In the end, the Q-ship story deserves to be remembered not because it was decisive. It wasn't. But because it reveals something profound about courage, innovation, and the human capacity to fight against impossible odds. Remember the day Gordon Campbell deliberately steered HMS Farnborough into the path of a German torpedo, trusting that the explosion wouldn't kill his crew, that his ship would survive long enough to spring the trap, that disciplined fire would destroy U-83 before she could escape. Remember the courage of 58 men who lay hidden beside their guns while their ship sank beneath them, while water flooded the compartments below, while they waited for the order to fire, trusting that their commander had calculated correctly, that the moment would come, that their sacrifice would matter. Remember that in a total war where technology seemed to favor the aggressor, where invisible submarines were starving Britain into submission, a handful of volunteers found a way to fight back using psychology, deception, and a willingness to endure what most people would consider unendurable. Remember that Britain in early 1917 was weeks away from starvation, that U-boats were winning the war at sea, that the Royal Navy, the most powerful maritime force in the world, seemed helpless against an enemy it couldn't see or catch. And remember that sometimes at critical moments, individual actions matter enormously. Campbell and his Q-ship crews didn't win the war by themselves, but they bought time. They sank U-boats. They forced changes in German tactics. They demonstrated that Britain could fight back, and ultimately, they helped Britain survive long enough for other measures, convoys, depth charges, American entry into the war, to tip the balance. Remember also the human cost, 24,000 casualties on both sides from Q-ship operations. Men like Captain Lieutenant Bruno Hopper, who died instantly when Campbell's first salvo struck U-83's conning tower. Men like Petty Officer Isaac Radford, killed when a torpedo struck HMS Pargust in June 1917. Brave men on both sides, doing their duty, dying in waters that are now empty and silent. Q-ships represented warfare at its most intimate and psychological. You looked your enemy in the eye. You deceived them deliberately. You used every psychological trick to make them trust you, then you killed them at point-blank range. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't clean, but it was necessary. And the men who served on Q ships, especially men like Gordon Campbell, who did it repeatedly, who pushed the tactic to its logical extreme, who deliberately got torpedoed because that was the only way to guarantee kills, deserve to rank among the bravest sailors in naval history. The numbers tell one story. 12 to 15 U-boats sunk, about 7% of total German submarine losses, modest tactical impact. But numbers alone miss the larger truth. Q ships changed how U-boats operated. They forced caution where boldness had reigned. They demonstrated British ingenuity and determination at a moment when both were desperately needed. And they provided examples of courage that inspired other sailors, other commanders, other innovations that cumulatively saved Britain from defeat. Gordon Campbell ended the war as one of the most decorated naval officers in British history. His Victoria Cross, his 3 Distinguished Service Orders, his Croix de Guerre. These medals represented not just his own courage, but the courage of every man who served on Q ships. In 1918, Campbell commanded the Guard of Honor of VC winners at the burial of the unknown warrior, standing with 99 other Victoria Cross recipients to honor the anonymous dead. It was fitting. Campbell knew better than most what courage looked like, what it cost, what it meant. After the war, he commanded HMS Tiger, served in Parliament, wrote his memoirs. He died in 1953 at age 67, his medals eventually passing to his great-nephew. In 2017, those medals sold at auction for £840,000, a world record, and will be displayed in a UK museum where people can learn Gordon Campbell's story. That's where this story ends, but also where it begins again. Because history isn't just facts and dates and statistics. History is people facing impossible choices, finding courage they didn't know they had, doing extraordinary things under extraordinary circumstances. Gordon Campbell faced an impossible choice on a grey morning in February 1917. He chose the torpedo. And in that choice, in that moment of calculated madness, he demonstrated something that every generation needs to remember. Sometimes the only way through impossible situations is to do what seems impossible. Sometimes courage looks like standing still while the world explodes around you. Sometimes winning requires sacrificing what you hold most dear, your safety, your ship, your certainty of survival, because the alternative is unthinkable defeat. This is our history, and it's worth remembering. Worth remembering the men who stood at hidden guns while their ships sank. Worth remembering the commanders who made impossible decisions and somehow got them right. Worth remembering that when Britain faced its darkest hour, when defeat seemed inevitable, ordinary men found extraordinary courage. February 17th, 1917. Commander Gordon Campbell stands on the bridge of HMS Farnborough and watches a torpedo track cutting through grey water toward his ship. In that frozen instant, he makes the decision that defines him. He steers into the torpedo's path. The explosion lifts the stern out of the water. The panic party scrambles into boats. U-83 surfaces, confident of victory. And then Campbell springs the trap, and 45 shells tear the submarine apart in 4 minutes of point-blank fury. That's the story. That's the courage. That's why it all matters. Remember.